Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the Independent Outlook. Coming to you from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and we try and bring you an independent perspective, an unusual perspective on the events of the day. Today, we're going to talk about the ideologization of the K-12 curriculum, some of the dynamics of looting and protesting in our era. Maybe we'll talk a little about illicit hairstyling and have some fun together. So let me welcome everybody who's joined us through ThinkSpot and all of our friends around the country. We're glad you're with us. We really appreciate the partnership with ThinkSpot so much. And I'm going to be talking today with my two colleagues, David Theroux. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to see you. And Williamson Evers. Bill, glad to see you too.
Good to see you.
David Theroux is the president of the Independent Institute, started this organization about 34 years ago, and Bill Evers, of course, is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence, and we are grateful to have quite a wonderful team here. So let's get going on some of these topics today. Bill, let me just turn to you first. A year ago, just about the time when you were joining the Independent Institute, you made quite a splash with a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the first draft of California's proposed ethnic studies curriculum, so-called. And you seem to have stirred up quite a tempest at that time. A lot of parents and other groups were concerned about it. They decided they would revise it, bring it back a year later, and now they've done so. So I thought, oh, surely they will please Bill Evers with their second go at it. But I just saw your piece published on Friday in the Wall Street Journal, telling us that critical ethnic studies returns to California. The state's new curriculum prefers victimization to minority achievement and Marxism to liberal values. Give our participants a little overview of what this all is all about, Bill.
Well, this is not about including things about slavery or the American Indians in regular American history. This is a separate standalone course that in California, students are going to be required to take a semester-long course in this in order to graduate. And so they're developing a curriculum for this. So as you said, a year ago, I had a column in the Wall Street Journal entitled, "California Wants to Teach Your Kids That Capitalism is Racist."
That was an incendiary title, Bill.
Well, they wrote the title, but it was accurate nonetheless. And so I went into the details of many of the things that were in this model curriculum. And so they toned it down some. As you said, they did send it back to the drawing board. But the basic concepts of it, which are a mixture of vulgar Marxism and identity politics. Mm-hmm. So by identity politics, essentially you mean the flip of what Martin Luther King said. He said, we should be judging people by the content of their character. We should look forward to a society where that goes on rather than one in which they're judged by the color of their skin. And the identity politics idea is we're always going to be judged by this color of our skin. Mm-hmm. We can never get out of this. And they want tribalism to be the fundamental building blocks of American society. And they don't think there's any real way to get out of it. So, and they want to teach this and embrace it. Mm-hmm. So that's the fundamental thing. My column this time made sort of 2 points. The first was that the people who have studied ethnic studies itself say that you can get some boost to kids staying in school, kids working harder, getting better grades, if you don't make it all about victims and oppression and this sort of thing, but instead you look at the resilience of ethnic groups, the inner resources, the cultural assets that people have, which I can get into a little bit.
Well, that sounds fairly positive.
Instead of just all this stuff about suffering and woe and so forth, which is part of history, of course. And then the second part of my column this time was, look, there are things that economics can teach us, that sociology can teach us, that political science can teach us about ethnic studies. And because these people that are designing these courses are so mired in Marxism and in this identity politics, they miss out on valuable things about the dynamics of interaction of racial groups, of ethnic groups, that would be important as well as fascinating for the children to learn about.
There seems to be a kind of reductionism in the perspective on American history that's found in this kind of curriculum.
Yes.
Like everything is seen through this one lens of groups in power competition, oppressor-oppressed relationship.
Right.
It's like there's some light coming from history, but you're shining it through this lens, and the lens is so distorting that it basically lights the paper on fire underneath it, and there's no history left.
So, for example, the ideologists behind this think, oh, if you talk about an African-American inventor who succeeded or a Mexican-American entrepreneur who succeeded, well, that's brainwashing the kids to think that you could succeed in America.
Oh, that's supposed to be negative.
But, I mean, yeah. And so you can't say that the Irish climbed the socioeconomic ladder or that despite being under conditions at one time or another where rooming houses and businesses said no Irish need apply, or Jews who had suffered the worst possible mistreatment and persecution and mass murder in history coming to the United States and succeeding. You can't do that. What you should instead teach children is that Irish and Jews have attained white racial privilege. So so according to them, the Irish and Jews are part of the oppressive capitalistic class.
Right.
And so if you think about Koreans, Chinese, Japanese immigrants to the United States, early generations, they had various mechanisms like loan clubs, which are kind of financial cooperatives, and friends and especially family would pool money, and they would rotate who got the money to start new businesses. Mm-hmm. And it was an extremely effective, up from the bootstraps form of self-help.
Self-help, yeah.
And, if you look at Oakland today, if you look at the garment industry in Los Angeles and any number of things, they're hugely effective by this upward climb of groups like this. And similar stories can be told about Black entrepreneurs. Independent Institute has a book about a Dr. Howard, who was a successful entrepreneur in the South, as well as a civil rights leader in the early days. Mm-hmm. And so...
Yeah, we published a book on that, David. Yes. I think you're kind of proud of that book, aren't you? Can you just remind us briefly?
Yes, and the book's won a number of book awards, and it's basically about Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who is a physician and an entrepreneur, as Bill said. And he was really one of the early organizers of the movement against Jim Crow and other government restrictions on blacks. He organized boycotts. He had huge festivals. He then moved to Chicago, did even more there. He mentored Medgar Evers, which is a whole long list of people who were influenced by him. But he was against government intrusions and manipulating of people based on race. And that was his code.
I am no relative of Medgar Evers, nor am I a relative of Governor Tony Evers of Wisconsin.
I was wondering that, Bill.
Put these facts on the table.
Right.
So speaking of books, pretty nearly around the same time as the Wall Street Journal ran this column, Independent Institute put on its website a bibliography, an annotated reading list that I pulled together. It's called A Crisis in Civil Rights. And part of it is about race and civil rights. And so people can find that on our website, independent.org. And in it points out a lot of things. And one of the things that I also point out in the Wall Street Journal is that envy figures a lot in race relations. So the Jews were envied in Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, in Germany at the time of the Holocaust. They had been emancipated. They were suddenly able to go into new professions, succeed on their merits in these professions. And people that were in an agrarian or aristocratic mindset and not ready for commercial society got envious. Who are these upstarts? And so their idea was kill them, And so we want to have, envy is always with us. It's part of human psychology. The question is it cabined? Is it constrained? Is it, we know from the Ten Commandments that the problem of coveting other people's holdings, other people's possessions, is a problem in human nature that has to be dealt with. And so, as Helmut Schuck wrote in his book about envy, some societies constrain it and channel it or whatever they do, but some societies emphasize it, allow it to run free, and with horrific results, such as the Holocaust and the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. One of the ironies also is the civil rights movement was organized to fight Jim Crow, which was adopted after the Black Codes many years earlier, after the Civil War. And the Black Codes were prescribing what blacks could do as far as professions, as far as where they could eat, where they could work, who they could marry, and so on and so forth. And those measures were adopted by progressives. And
also, they were a way. David is right that progressives and proto-progressives had a lot to do with this, but they
were adopted essentially because in an open market, the incentives of business people is to make money and to sell as much of your goods and services as possible. So if you discriminate against some group, you're going to lose that business, and others who compete with you are going to gain the business.
Right.
So capitalism actually has built into it incentives to fight against discrimination. Because of this, Jim Crow was passed to cartelize markets and restrict blacks from being competitive.
Prevent blacks from competing.
That's right, exactly. So one thing that many of the civil rights people did not learn is this lesson. And it's the same thing with apartheid. Apartheid was passed because of the fact that blacks were coming down.
Black workers were going into skilled professions, doing the specialized dynamiting and one thing or another.
The only way to stop them was to use government power based on race. But the point is that if you actually don't have these restrictions, the racial tensions disappear by and large. People are able to progress, to uplift themselves, and so on and so forth. And so what progressives did is they used the same prescription of race-based law after the civil rights movement, and then now it's taken to an extreme. And
in South Africa,
they won't admit, they can't really admit to themselves that maybe government power is the problem.
In South Africa, the striking white supremacist socialist labor unions struck under the banner, "Workers of the world unite for the white race."
That's right.
Wow.
Exactly.
And the British executed a few of the leaders, and on the gallows they sang the red flag.
Yes.
The song of British revolutionary socialism.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is that wherever there is a system where private property rights are secure, where exchange is free, and contracts are protected by law, there's a huge disincentive for racism.
Right.
And
exactly.
yet this curriculum that the bureaucrats in Sacramento created basically tells students that the capitalist system is the source of racism, whereas in fact history shows it's the antidote to racism. What's going on with these people?
They're basically enamored by this ideology. It's ideologically driven. And even though empirically, historically, you can show that it's not true, the ideology is, a civic religion, and they buy into it, and they don't want to give it up.
That's right.
That's kind of stunning. Well, you mentioned, Bill, that there was some of those interesting historical comparisons with the position of the Jewish community in Spain at the time of the Inquisition. Fast forward now to California in 2020. I understand from some of the things I read that some of the Jewish groups in California were not happy with the recommended curriculum. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Well, so a lot of this was explicit in the version from last year. where they had extensive things about Palestinian Arabs and, things that were kind of in the guise of anti-Zionism or anti-Israel, but were really anti-Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the State Department of Education took those lessons out, except, of course, the part about Jews and white privilege that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, right, which is probably one of the most pernicious parts.
But the Curriculum Commission, at least a number of the members of it, want to put it back. So make Arab Americans part of Asian Americans and then put in lesson plans and so forth. So we really haven't seen the final on this. They did put in this law last Monday that they're not supposed to be inciting ethnic hatred and ethnic prejudice in these lessons. But, the problem is that these ideologues think, well, we're not inciting anything but the truth, right? When we do these anti-Semitic things.
Right.
So they don't view themselves as doing anything objectionable. They're just presenting the facts. Of course, they're telling the truth there. They are inciting racial hatred.
I mean, basically.
So, and this thing about envy that I mentioned is another reason to mention a book published by the Independent Institute, because Independent Institute has tackled this in a book called In All Fairness, a fairly recent book. And David is pointing.
Which I happen to have a copy of right here. Worth getting.
So excuse us for a moment while we toot our horn, but I really think
Shameless
it's a
plug.
Shameless plug, but it's nonetheless a valuable book. I wouldn't mention it if I didn't think so.
On Monday, when the legislature took this up and finally sent it forward to the governor, as you said, they made a few adjustments. I think it's a kind of a sugar coating. There were two things that really struck me about it. One was that they said, well, there's going to be a recommended curriculum, but various local school boards, including charter schools, can adapt or create their own ethnic studies curricula. So that sounded like a sop to local choice. And then there was the thing you just said about how it's not supposed to, whatever you teach is not supposed to promote religious doctrine and not promote any bias or bigotry or discrimination, which I think satisfied some of the concerns or seemed to. But what strikes me about this is that even with those, slight softenings, what you've got here is you have the authority of the state of California injecting a lethal toxin into the body politic through the children, endorsing this progressive critical theory, critical studies approach to history. Whether every single student gets it or not, the state has still taken its position in the culture wars, and it is going to promote this approach to history and to the meaning of human life. How can the state get away with taking sides on these kind of contentious ideological issues?
Well, the problem is once you have public schools and taxpayers' dollars, then you have politics. And once you have politics, you don't have the pluralism that exists in the marketplace or in regular civil society. You have winners and losers by force, by coercion.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people who are well organized and well placed are going to dominate. And in higher education, in this particular field of ethnic studies, these vulgar Marxists and identity politics people dominate the scene and have since the 1960s when this discipline came into existence. So you're right that this is a state-endorsed model. And yes, and they're putting the imprimatur of the government on it.
Right, that's my point.
And that is your point. I think it's a very valid one. The other thing is, most districts don't have the confidence, the energy, the wherewithal to invent their own curriculum.
Oh, certainly not.
So if you go to a group of teachers and say, okay, we're not giving you any extra money, but on your own time, please come up with the books, the course sequence, the quizzes, the this, the that, or We have one that's pre-ready, already ready for you,
Right.
and is signed, sealed, and delivered by the state of California.
Think software. You set the default setting. Yes, you can go into the preferences and change the options, but the default setting prevails over everything. And David, you know a lot about schooling. I was going to ask you, David, just on a broad brush, is there an alternative to this kind of state-dominated education?
Well, of course, under the COVID-19 shutdown, schools are not open, and parents have been desperate to figure out what to do. And so there's been a real growth in private schooling, homeschooling, online learning, none of which is ideal necessarily. But there is a realization by, I think, most parents, especially the mothers, that the school system is not accountable to them. It's accountable to the political system, which is more clearly that of the control of the teachers' unions. I do think that one of the other problems with this being California is that California, because of the size of the school system, has a huge impact on the content of textbooks, because publishers want to produce textbooks that will be used everywhere. And so this is going to have a big thumb on the scale of the standards throughout the country. And of course, the basic point of this ideology is that racism causes everything. That's
Right.
ill.
So my granddaughter just started college, and so her first class, she comes in, and what do they have up on the screen? A quiz to self-reveal how racist you are.
That's right, exactly.
Wow.
And again, it gets back to this reigning ideology of progressivism that is treating people as members of groups, that people don't have their own agency, they don't have a moral sense, they can't discern things. And those that do rise up because of merit clearly are essentially adopting white nationalism or whiteness, or whatever you want to call it, the white mind, some people say.
Yeah.
And it's really folly, because it's like we talked about a couple of weeks ago about the African American Museum at the Smithsonian. It's this view that normal culture, traditional values should be abandoned.
Objectivity. These are all toxic whiteness.
Right. Reason,
Crazy.
Right.
They're universally valid ways to approach the world and get ahead and tackle nature and tackle
so I mean, the idea of
jobs
achieving
and problems.
something and success is considered to be a sellout. But I mean, there's so many ways to refute this stuff. I mean, the people who propose that are claiming that their measure, their view, has merit, and that adopting it is going to create success of some sort. And of course, that's just incoherent, because by the very nature of their claim, there is no such thing.
It's an even greater problem in some ways, because they believe to debate them, to try to argue with them in terms of logic and fact, is part of the illegitimate oppressive system.
It's a recognition that there's another view.
Yeah, there is no other view as far as they're concerned.
That's right.
Why debate?
Yeah,
The commitment to free exchange is itself considered a form of false consciousness.
Yes, exactly.
And we've seen this.
One of the other factors in the different racial groups where they're portrayed is that Asians are overrepresented in tech, which is immoral. The court case at Harvard is probably the most recent example of this in higher education. But you could say, African Americans overrepresented in the NBA, so that's immoral. So instead of paying LeBron James more than me to be a basketball player is some sort of an inequity. And so the whole thing is...
David, I think you should be conscripted into professional basketball and forced to play.
People would be very disappointed.
We should be forced to watch you.
I think people would pay me not to play.
Well, possible.
Listen, one thing I just want to point out, I mean, we are, we may sound like we're grousing, but actually there's a thread running through all of what we've said thus far. We're trying to actually analyze the dynamics of this ideological phenomenon as expressed in the K through 12 curriculum. And I think, Bill Evers, one of our goals and one of your goals is to equip people with the resources of mind to diagnose and analyze some of these things. Can
Yes.
you talk a little bit about your relevant bibliography you've recently made available?
Well, I talked a little bit about the race part of it. It's got some other things in it. It has one on anti-Semitism. It's a very heavily written about thing, and I made a big effort to sort through a huge literature and pick out the best things. It's often just thought, oh, it's just hatred of Jews, okay, for no reason. But it's often more complicated in that, as I mentioned, envy participates in it, cultural rivalry, say, in the ancient world between the Hellenistic world and Jewish values, succession in the Roman Empire also figured in the ancient world, but a huge thing in the modern world, so we're talking about from 1870 to the present, is envy of successful Jews after the Jewish emancipation. So then there's one on police reform, which could not be a more topical subject.
Right.
But so my bibliography on police reform heavily discusses police unions. Now, it's interesting. So my main field, of course, is education. And in education, there is very little scholarly literature on the teachers' unions. My former colleague at Hoover, Terry Moe, has written on it, but hardly any other people. There's very few books or anything. So the police unions are sort of similar. I mean, there are some articles. There really aren't good books on the subject. And but anyway, I gather in this bibliography a ton of stuff on unions, and you can see things like as collective bargaining kicks in, unanswered police complaints about the police go way up, and all sorts of interesting things that go on. And the front page of the Los Angeles Times today is all about how the police unions in California blocked reforms in the state legislature,
Right.
which just ended on Monday. It was the last day of session. And here was this opening, here was this huge demand from the public to improve things. Now, doesn't mean every proposed reform is right, but basically they hobbled everything. They stalled, they misdirected, they are brilliant at it, but people need to realize that public employee unions are very self-serving, and they don't serve the public in any way. They give special privileges to their members.
Right.
I might add that in the upcoming fall issue of our journal, The Independent Review, the cover article is on police unions and how they have been used to shield people from accountability, and also to soak the taxpayer as far as funding pensions and all sorts of other things, but especially the issue of accountability.
Yes.
And people are concerned, and people are rightfully concerned for people being held accountable in any field, but
right.
the current issue, of course, is how blacks are treated by police. And yet you hear very little about the fact that police unions are not the only factor, but one of the dominant factors in the accountability issue.
So George Floyd, when he was killed, when he was murdered, there was one guy leaning on his neck, but there were other policemen involved right there. One of them was a black. So this isn't mentioned very often, and it doesn't, I don't know what that exact means, but it means at least one thing is that we need to look at police training, police methods per se, and not just at race relations.
That's right.
So my last
racism
topic
is the only criteria, you'll get nowhere.
Yeah. So my last topic in this bibliography is on poverty and the welfare state. And so, in a sense, one of the cures that some people propose for the current crisis in race relations and related matters is vast expansion of the welfare state. So this bibliography goes into how that's pretty problematic. There hasn't been a lot of success in the programs of the welfare state. A lot of times the welfare state has been used just to buy votes. And you can look at, say, the programs of the New Deal. One of Independent Institute's top scholars, Williamson Schuchardt has shown that the New Deal spending went to areas where the Democrats were in trouble and not to the areas of greatest need.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is hardly confined to the New Deal.
If you actually, again, another shameless plug, we have a book called The Voluntary City, and it shows that consistently the success of overcoming abject poverty and crime and other urban problems is when people were free to solve them. And in most urban areas, you've got many of these communities facing everything run by the government. You've got government health care and schools and parks and housing and what have you, and little opportunity for business development or entrepreneurship or mutual aid societies or anything like that. But the case is just overwhelming. And if you look at these different ethnic groups, why do certain ethnic groups uplift themselves out of abject poverty and others not? And of course, Tom Sowell is the leading expert on this. But this is not as if it's some sort of far out, undocumented approach to the issue. It's really the issue of people being free to improve their lives.
So Sowell's book, Ethnic America, is filled with that, and
That's
there's
right.
a lot of it in his other books.
Right.
Tremendous book, yeah. So, what's going on here is that these ideological currents are getting accelerated in the reaction to some of these shootings, which have, taken over the news, probably in part because people are so fed up under pandemic conditions, and then any little tinderbox makes it worse. It's kind of stunning, really. However, to look at some of these incidents, many of which are indeed very troubling, where African Americans seem to be singled out, but then sometimes the fervor to make everything fit into a kind of progressive so-called social justice framework seems to override the need to look at the facts and carefully evaluate due process and so forth. And not only that, but even where, in fact, African American citizens were unjustly treated by police, which, I think they have been in many cases, even where that is the case, then there seemed to be a bunch of opportunism around these events, which has broken out in looting and violence in Chicago, from Minneapolis originally, Chicago, now Kenosha, and elsewhere. It's kind of stunning to see the rationalizations being offered for this kind of violence, which seems to accompany these protests or flow out of them. It's hard sometimes to tell where one leaves off and the other begins. But I wondered if either of you saw that thing that was on NPR. It was an interview with Vicky Osterweil, who wrote this book, In Defense of Looting, which is featured on one of their podcasts and promoted on npr.org. She says that looting is a strategic resistance tactic that has been used for centuries to fight injustice. And the NPR, interviewer is giving this a very sympathetic hearing in the interview. And the author goes on to say, looting demonstrates that without police and without state oppression, we can have things for free. And that those who oppose looting are driven by anti-blackness and contempt for poor people who want to live a better life, Osterweil claims. Can this really be the case on tax-supported national public radio?
Well, she is claiming that mass expropriation of property is just looting, i.e., she calls it sharing for free, and it's a form of reparations. One of the obvious questions is, if ex-looter gets a big screen TV and looter number B does not, does looter number B have the right to take looter A's big screen TV?
Wait. Looters against looters?
And where does this end?
Expropriate the expropriators.
Right. And so this is, again, it's another rationalization for this sort of collectivist approach to things.
Well, I think we should go with the Ten Commandments again. Thou shalt not steal.
Right.
Exactly, right.
But, remember the Yippee book, Steal This Book, right?
Yeah. Abby Hoffman.
Although he did want you to pay for it.
Well, the reality of this is that it's not free.
No,
People had to
certainly not.
spend money to build these things, and these are livelihoods of people. So if you burn down a building or a store, you're destroying the livelihood of people, and you're endangering the lives of people in addition from the very act. So the people who've been killed or seriously harmed by these riots, the social justice warriors don't seem to care a whit about.
Not at all.
And I would go further to say that property rights, I mean, the attack on property rights is, it's a Marxist view. The Marxists are not the only ones that had that view, but that's the current justification. But I would go further to say that property rights are human rights.
Absolutely.
And that if you don't own your own body, if you don't own the food that you put in your mouth, you can't survive, you can't live. And hence, since only individuals exist, if individuals can't own property to support and sustain life, then human life can't exist. And so the whole thing is incoherent.
I would like to echo David on this and even go one step farther, and that is to say, we can't do without property rights. Even socialist societies have rules whereby some bureaucrat is in charge of allocating physical goods to some person or another. It's a kind of unjust property right. The point that David is making is that people in the earliest days brought things into regular use. They got cattle, they got dogs, they got little plots of land. These expanded. As long as that was going on justly, they were fairly trading with other people, honestly trading with other people. It grows up into the situation we have today. And if there are things that were done unfairly, then if there's a stolen, like take the Jews that were stolen from at the time of the German National Socialism, and you hear about artworks or furniture or one thing or another that gets discovered later. Okay, give it back to them. But some poor immigrant in a downtown of a city who's just built up a business to go burn that down is the most evil injustice imaginable.
It's unbelievable, yeah. And many of the victims have been African-American business owners in these riots recently.
That's right.
Yeah, but whatever color they are, it's just
doesn't matter,
evil.
yeah.
That's right.
There's also a term called the tragedy of the commons, which is the idea that if you don't have clearly defined property rights, resources of some sort are held in common, which is, sort of a communist perspective that there are no individual rights to assets at all. But the problem with the tragedy of the commons is that since no one owns it, and we all own it in common, you create an incentive for people to fight over who sets the rules, as Bill was saying.
And overuse
abuse, pollution, degradation.
Right.
And there are many different sort of stereotype views about someone who is tilling a field and they have no right to it, and so someone sends their cows through to eat the corn. So why should the person till the field in the first place?
Right.
And so property rights are intrinsically needed for civilization, for society,
not only
for civil
just,
society.
But they're necessary. Yes.
Right.
And there's just so much sloppy thinking here. There's a slogan, property is theft. That doesn't make any sense because you can only have theft if somehow somebody is taking a thing from somebody who's legitimately holding it.
That's right.
If the workers take over a factory and they control it as a kind of cooperative, I'm not saying they should, but then they're kind of claiming a property right.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And then what about when half of them die of old age? Who can come in? That's a property rights problem. Even if they form a voluntary cooperative, it's a property rights problem that has to be addressed. So any socialist who thinks they can get out of these problems with some kind of magical thinking, they're wrong, because they're going to get out of it through tyranny and despotism.
Well, let's take Portland, for example. Someone is an arsonist and burns down a store. Now, that store was owned by the person who bought or built it, whatever, But the arsonist is claiming, no, it's my store, and I can use it as I want. I can destroy it if I want.
Right.
So it's a claim of property. The question is it a just claim?
It's not.
And it's not. I mean, it's basically just using violence against innocent people.
Exactly.
And of course, that's what the Nazis did do against the Jews. And the Soviets did against the Jews and many other ethnic groups.
And they did it against the wealthy peasants. And
right,
they
the
did
history
it
is full of this. The Turks did it against the Armenians. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
And so...
And the Turks mobilized envy against the successful Armenians.
That's exactly right.
So it wasn't just that the Armenians were Christians. Yes. They were successful Christians.
That's right.
So this approach, which basically tries to fit everything into the parameters of oppressor relationship, is this kind of a proto or neo or modern Marxism. It seems to be a kind of intellectual compulsion among a lot of people in the intellectual classes in North America now. To me, there's something similar between the curricular thing we were talking about before and this matter of justifying looting. In both cases and in many others, there's this compulsive effort to force the facts to fit this ideological framework. It's a really worrisome trend because we're talking about people who are sitting comfortably behind an NPR microphone or a university podium or whatever, and they're basically feeding people these ideas, which you've just been enumerating, which then lead to action and violence. And somehow the people who can foment this seem to feel that they can get away with it. I would encourage anyone who could to check out our website. We have a really interesting article by William Watkins on Jacob Blake and a forced narrative about the riots in Kenosha. This is on independent.org. And I also wanted to point out that Jacob Blake's family promptly condemned the violence and the looting.
That's right.
But their voice got drowned out.
Well, many of these incidents have been shown to not fit the narrative. I mean, they don't
right.
live up to the truth. I mean, for example, the issue of George Floyd, the county medical examiner has issued his report, and the report shows that not only was Floyd in the car complaining about not being able to breathe, but that he had a fatal amount of fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to gently disagree with you, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's quite possible that those drugs that he had large amounts of were causing him to feel he couldn't breathe.
No, I think that's right.
But the proximate cause of his death was choking.
It could be. I'm simply pointing out that the narrative
It's a complication.
This is the county medical examiner's claim, and the medical examiner also claimed that he did not die of suffocation. But the point I'm simply making is that in many of these instances, people leap to conclusion because it fits this narrative. I mean, for example, the idea that property is theft and robberies or redistribution or reparations has been a theme of many of the heist movies going back for decades. So the heist movie is the robbers are the heroes, and they're essentially going after the capitalist or the casino owner or something. Mm-hmm. And this is noble, and it's cool, and all the rest of it. And this goes back for decades because the elite culture has bought into this view, and I think part of it is relates to this sort of secularization of ethics, which means there are no ethics. And it's simply moral relativism, which you can get away with. The end justifies the means, and so on and so forth. But of course,
we're talking about elites and their values.
Yes, right.
How about across the bridge in San Francisco? Talk about someone who got caught in the act.
Yeah, I was talking about the people, sitting behind their podiums in universities spouting progressive socialism. But hey, right across the bay, nobody can go out and get haircuts except for the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The question is, is this criticism fair of Nancy Pelosi, or are we just being little snipers here?
Well, I think both are the case, but I think it is telling and as Angela Codavilla has pointed out, there is a political class, and the political class wants to make the decisions to rule over the so-called country class, which is the bulk of the population. And they don't want their views questioned, which fits in with the narrative that we're talking about. And in Pelosi's case, for those who haven't heard, she had a shampoo and blow dry, in a shuttered hair salon, which is against the law, and she wasn't wearing a mask. And in response to being caught on surveillance cameras of this, her response is, "But I was following what I thought were the rules of the salon." Now, the salon owner said, "That's ridiculous." And so here she's caught again in one of these situations in which the rules don't apply to her because she's part of the elite.
And of course, the question arises whether that rule should be enforced in the first place or not.
Certainly, that's right. And the woman who owned the salon has been interviewed, and of course, she's saying that she has been shut down since March, and they were going to reopen in July, and she complied with all the ordinances to be able to do that, and then they changed their mind. So she says in her area that there are no businesses open; they're all shuttered. Right. The people are leaving. Their customers are leaving. So who benefits from this? Well, the people like Pelosi don't have to pay the price. And so
I think we should get back. We should get back to your point, David, about a kind of class analysis or caste analysis or group analysis of this, right. And Angela Codavilla's insight that there are some people, and that would include the three of us, who can work from their homes easily. Right? We're lucky. We don't have to run a lathe in a factory. We don't have to load boxes into the back of a truck. We don't have to shampoo hair. We're white-collar people who are merchants of ideas, analysts of ideas. And mine is very blue and David's is likewise blue. But the point is, not that you have a more academic tie than the two of us. The point is that many of the people who are telling other people what to do, the regular people, the man and woman on the street what to do, the hair salon owners what to do, are people whose salaries and income are not threatened. They're on the taxpayer's dime. Right. They have academic tenure. They have something that can't really be taken away.
The schools, the school teacher unions are getting paid.
The school
anyway.
Teachers union, they're getting paid.
Right.
I mean,
so there's
I don't want to overdo how well off the three of us are, because if nobody donates to Independent Institute, we go out of business. We're not on the taxpayer's dime.
We need you all.
Yes. But the point is, there is a class difference between the person that can work at home in his or her pajamas and still get paid and often is in a position to tell the rest of the country what to do, and the people who are the ones that suffer from this diktat from the top.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think that one of the reasons why this video of Pelosi went so viral so quickly is because of the fact that people are upset about being shut down, and they see this hypocrisy, and they want to essentially see their own views validated, but also they want to express their distaste for this absurdity. And Pelosi hasn't even admitted she's wrong. And that's part.
She says, I was set up, which is completely false.
Yes.
It's very clear from the emails that her staff set up the appointment.
That's right. That's right. Well, her spokesman, Drew Hamill, claimed Pelosi was following the rules as presented to her, which of course is preposterous, because Pelosi knows full well that, she just talked about people not wearing masks are evil.
Yeah, she had to put down the Republicans for not going masks every moment, and there she is cavorting around inside a building with and close to other people without a mask on.
So the connection here between Pelosi and the riots and the curriculum becomes pretty clear. Yeah. It's this view that some elite is going to impose rules on people, and they're going to use a narrative to keep people in their place. And fortunately, more and more people are being clued into this. And, Graham asked me earlier about schools. We have a book coming out called Really Good Schools by James Tooley, which is about desperately poor people in developing countries creating their own private schools for the poor at essentially with virtually no money. And so if more and more people can see that they don't have to depend upon the teachers' union educational blob to get their kids educated, that's going to change a lot of things. And that lesson is not unique to education. It's true in the cross-section of society.
So
and
I think
Pelosi sort of
Graham
represents the person who's trying to impose it and the hypocrite that she is.
But I think Graham was also getting at the idea of, well, maybe these rules in the hair salons are counterproductive, unnecessary, and stupid. So I have a proposal. We will stop retweeting and reposting on Facebook Nancy Pelosi going through this hair salon, and in return, she can liberate us from this tyranny of all this lockdown stuff that's not needed.
There you go. I mean, Hairgate is going to be a big deal for a long time.
I think that's right. But again, I mean, Pelosi's husband, Paul, I've met, and he's a successful businessman. And there are many people in the Pelosi family who are quite admirable people. Now, she is the daughter of the former mayor of Baltimore, comes from a political family, but she is extremely wealthy. So are the measures that of redistributing wealth, does she want Antifa to come to her houses and burn it down? I don't think so. So
I don't think so.
We've got to have some sort of standard that's universal, which is the idea of the rule of law, which applies to every person. One other point I'll mention just briefly is that technically, we're all African Americans. We all came out of Africa originally. And the idea of different colors, skin tones, Indians have dark skin, so do Polynesians. Now, Indians who come to America have been very successful. So why are they not discriminated against and suffering the same way that other dark-skinned people are? It must be some other factor other than racism. And that's what I think we're getting at, is that it's culture, it's opportunity, it's eliminating government barriers, and not to socialize things so people are kept down.
We probably need to bring this to a landing pretty soon here, but how about one last little incendiary question, which is emerging sort of indirectly out of the questions being submitted by our ThinkSpot friends. When these riots and looting and so forth erupted, politicians, reacted to them in different ways. President Trump, of course, is always talking. Joe Biden seemed a little quiet at first, and then he seemed to also condemn the looting. I'm not sure what Kamala Harris has said. Do you think that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have really been as forthrightly condemning the violence and looting as Jacob Blake's family has?
I don't think so.
No,
it's interesting that he condemns looting and violence, but he never condemns looters or killers or assaulters.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He's trying to make it more abstract. So if you're a potential voter who's engaged in some kind of nefarious act, doesn't want you to feel targeted by him. And I certainly noticed that in his rhetoric.
Yeah, he doesn't. He doesn't go after groups that are organized, essentially domestic terrorists.
Yeah, he won't name the groups that are behind it. So
that's true.
Wonder.
He will not.
And I think like Kamala Harris, Biden and his handlers are following the polls very closely and putting their finger up to the wind. And as it changes course, they'll adapt to that to try to stay ahead of it. I think that actually they've fallen behind. Whether they can catch up again is another story. But I think that what Bill is saying also is key, is that they're not willing to take the step to actually hold people accountable, those people who actually did the crimes, accountable for their acts. It's a general...
Well, they have made some suggestions about prosecuting people, but the interesting thing is, in these cities, the Democratic officials have generally said, well, unless we catch you murdering somebody, we're just going to view it as protest hijinks, and we're not going to do anything.
Yeah, protest
And
hijinks is a dangerous concept.
They've said this explicitly, and so, as the famous essayist Andrew Sullivan has said, if you tell people you're not serious about law enforcement, they'll take it as a license to disobey the law. And
So here the mayor of Portland, his condo building was attacked. They tried to burn the building down. They weren't able to. But so he's now relocated, I think, to a beach house.
Oh.
But, and he's quite liberal.
Is he holding the people accountable who tried to burn the building down?
Man.
I haven't seen it. No.
As always, the people who most need the protection of the clearly enforced rule of law are those who are least fortunate and most vulnerable.
That's right. Exactly.
And we encourage, through a lot of our research, a clarity about the rule of law that equitably protects everybody. And private property, which is probably the best guarantor of human dignity that we have found historically.
Right.
It's been a pleasure to talk with my colleagues, Bill Evers and David Theroux. Thanks, gentlemen, for being part of a kind of freewheeling conversation. Thanks also to ThinkSpot for being our co-sponsor today. We really appreciate their partnership. We invite you to visit independent.org to take a look at those book lists that Bill Evers mentioned on the various subjects like racism and civil rights and social justice. I forget everything you said, Bill, but there's quite a wonderful list of best books on socialism, too.
Right. And just go to our homepage at independent.org and you'll find them.
You'll find it. Yeah. I mean, basically what we are trying to offer to everybody on this call and to the public at large is a perspective that really is grounded in rigorous thinking, research, and evidence. It's not just grousing, but we're not just pussyfooting around either. These things have real world meaning. And so we invite you to join us in our work. Thank you for watching Independent Outlook. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And Bill.
Thank you.
And thank you, ThinkSpot.
And thank you, ThinkSpot, and we'll see you all next time. Take care from the Independent Institute. Bye-bye.